Peter, thank you for doing this. This is your last day as chairman of the board at ICANN. Can you give me a sense of what that means for you?
Sure, Brad. It's certainly mixed emotions. On the one hand, it's been a tremendously exciting time. It's been very busy in the last 4 years at ICANN. We've achieved an enormous amount as a team. We've had IDNs coming in at the CCTLD level and work soon to make them available for everyone. We've just passed the new GTLD program, which the community has spent so many years collectively working on. That's thoroughly tested all of our policy development mechanisms, and we've now come out of it with this good program. We've had the changing of the relationship with the United States government, which was deeply embedded in the original formation of the internet and hence of ICANN, and we've changed that. So there's been some tremendous success and tremendous movement on so many things. So it's been good to be part of that. I'll be sorry to lose the intensity and the passion that's gone around those projects. On the other hand, I've been here since before there was an ICANN, and I feel it's time to move on. And there's a tremendous crop of new board members and new councillors and new volunteers throughout the ICANN organisation. We've seen an enormous growth in the CCNSO, for example. The country code managers are continuing to join up to support the model, which was very important to my original reasons for coming to ICANN, and we've seen strong growth in the membership of the Governmental Advisory Committee and everywhere. So I'm feeling it's time to move on and looking forward to the next chapter.
You say you'll miss the intensity, but aren't you actually reclaiming your life?
Yes, I am. I mean, obviously this has taken a lot of time and energy that I've been happy to give, and it'll be nice to have some of that back and to move into new projects. When I go into those, of course, I'm taking with me a tremendous amount of experience and learning that I'm very grateful to ICANN and the ICANN community for giving me. I've been very well supported throughout while I've been here, and I want to just record that. I think the tremendous support from the community as we've worked through some of these difficult issues of me personally, I very much appreciate, and tremendously from the staff as well. Anything I've wanted, anything I've asked for, anything I've suggested has always been tremendously well received by the staff who've given their total support to the office of the chairman.
A couple of days ago at a reception honoring your tenure, you talked about how the ICANN community had helped you deal with the tragic loss of your wife, of your father, and your brother in an auto accident 5 years ago. Can you elaborate on that? How exactly did the ICANN community help you deal with that tragedy?
Well, in a number of ways, Brad. First of all, at the time of the crash itself, there was just a huge number of messages coming and flowers and support, which made me realise, that I had friends all through the community and the family. And then since then, being able to devote energy to these projects in some ways has been a kind of solace. Actually working, I wouldn't call it a distraction, but it's been a very happy way of throwing myself into another set of challenges, which in some ways have sort of compensated for the terrible loss.
What's the most difficult part of doing what you do?
Other than answering questions like the last one, it's keeping the harnessing the energy. I think there's a tremendous amount of energy coming from all quarters, all of it well-intentioned, but much of it pulling in slightly different directions. So I see it very much as harnessing that direction, harnessing that energy, and pointing it in what seems to be the consensus is the best direction. It's not about what I think is necessarily best. It's about trying to establish what the general consensus is the best direction, and then making sure we keep going that way.
Is it the definition of where you need to go? Is it the definition or building that consensus?
I think it's the latter. I think what the processes we have do is expose the issue, generate the views about that, and some sense of priority about them. And then the chair's job is basically to make sure that the most important tasks are being dealt with first. So keeping the priority of the organisation orderly, and then making sure then that the energy is harnessed around those priorities and in those directions.
Some people have said that being ICANN board chair is like herding cats. Unfair? Accurate?
Yes, I think it's a cliche that doesn't really apply that well to ICANN, because there's so many different parts to it, and I think the differences between the interests of the Government Advisory Committee from the intellectual property constituency, from the at-large constituency, from the staff, from the function of the Ombudsman. All of these are completely different groups. I think the idea of cats is at least you're dealing with a single species, whereas here we've got this wonderful multi-stakeholder model, and all those stakeholders are very different, come from different backgrounds, have different needs, have come to ICANN for different reasons and want to get something different out of it. So the job is keep trying to get the alignment of interests and working out what the common factors are, and once that's been done, then executing on that particular issue.
But you mentioned that almost casually. I imagine finding that point of commonality on any given issue. I don't see how you're able to do that, factoring in not only the multi-stakeholder model where people are coming from, but the regional diversity.
You're right to add that in as well, and there's linguistic diversity and cultural and religious and ethnic and other diversities. So yes, it's complicated. What we do at ICANN though is we create platforms for discussion around those topics. We have an open and transparent bottom-up process which takes into account all of those different processes. Every single voice is heard, and we take enough time, I think, to distill the issues around in the particular forums and through the discussion processes and the public comment processes that eventually from all that diversity eventually can come some kind of coherent view. And I think take the new GTLD program. We had very different views about whether we should have it at all, if we should have it, when we should have it, and what should the features of it be. And this week we've managed to sort of crystallize all those into a program which most people regard as pretty good. Everybody thinks it could be improved by giving them what they wanted that they didn't get in the consensus building process. And I think that's probably a healthy sign. That's the usual sign of good consensus, when everyone can live with it, but everyone's got some slight beef about some aspect of it that they could improve.
Would you put the approval of the GTLD program at the top of your list of accomplishments?
I'm not sure I would. I think it's certainly one of the biggest activities that we've done. It's been the biggest budget activity. It's taken the longest. It's also going to most dramatically change the look of the internet for ordinary internet users. So clearly it's one of the most significant achievements of ICANN in my time. But I think equally important would be long term for the future of the internet would be the changing of the relationship with the United States government and moving away from the sense that ICANN was, if you like, an organ of the United States government. And a lot of people outside the United States tended to see the relationship between ICANN and the US government as very close and too close. And I think shifting from ICANN being accountable to the US government on a reporting basis frequently to being responsible and accountable to the entire world community, I think historically that's probably going to be seen in the end as more significant. I think in 5 or 6 years' time people will not be able to understand why there was any problem with the new GTLDs. It'll become so much embedded as part of the process that the fact that we had to go through a process to get there will become lost. And historically, what will be more important is the expanding responsibility of ICANN as the steward of all of that service. And I suppose a corollary to that is the growing support of governments for the multi-stakeholder model, as evidenced by their participation in the GAC itself, and also by the defence that we get from governments of the multi-stakeholder model in other fora in their own countries. I think the development of the multi-stakeholder model as the mechanism for dealing with this multi-jurisdictional, multinational, crucial infrastructural resource. We're the first. We're the first resource that's being dealt with on that kind of a way. Other systems have grown up nationally. You think of broadcasting, which is now global, and as you think of air travel, for example, which is global, or credit cards, which operate. We've got other systems, but they've all grown up nationally, and then there's been bilateral and then multilateral treaties which have explained them, whereas the internet sort of went global almost immediately, and we've had to develop a global solution straight away. And the multi-stakeholder model that we've pioneered is the way. I think that the development of that in the end historically will be seen as more important than any one of the particular projects that we've undertaken, like IDNs or new GTLDs.
So in other words, what you're saying is you've seen an actual reshaping of the organization. You seem to be saying to me the reshaping of the organization is your most proud achievement. Yep.
Well, not the reshaping of the organisation internally. We've certainly done a lot of that. I've seen it grow from a staff of 3 or 4 to a staff of now between 120 and 140, depending on how you do the count. We've seen a complete change of the board committee structures, for example. We've created new board committees so that all of the work now done by ICANN has board oversight, which I think is what the community was wanting. But I'm not really talking about the internal mechanisms. They will change and adjust as the circumstances change, and we'll adapt the organisation to fit. I'm much more concerned, I think, with the the role of the organisation, the principle of having a multi-stakeholder organisation responsible for this crucial resource. I think the relationship that that body has had with the international community, I think that change is the most important one.
To what extent did the debate on the GTLD program redefine the relationship between ICANN and the Governmental Advisory Committee?
I don't think it redefined it. I think what it was because it's already defined in the bylaws, we've created the Governmental Advisory Committee to give us advice on matters of public policy that is the proper domain of governments. They're the experts in that, and they have a very legitimate and historic concern for protecting the public policy interest and protecting the rights of citizens. They deal with issues that are beyond ICANN, and they criminal matters, fraud, revenue, etc., child pornography, and all those sorts of issues that are not part of the ICANN mandate. We have to have them involved to deal with those issues. And we've created a situation where they can give us advice and we can consider that advice. And historically, we haven't had a circumstance where we've disagreed with that advice. But the bylaws provide for that. And what the new GTLD process has done is actually tested all of the available mechanisms, I think, for the first time. We've never had an issue which has crossed across all of the constituencies, including the governments, and required such an extensive sort of cross-cultural, cross-organisational discussion. So I don't think it hasn't changed the relationship, but it certainly tested all of the mechanisms.
Peter, you took some criticism after the last meeting in San Francisco when you said you wanted an early board vote here in Singapore on the new GTLD program with the idea of celebrating its passage, the criticism being that passage was preordained.
Well, it wasn't preordaining the passage, but it seemed pretty clear to me at the time that certainly we were converging to a point where we would be able to move forward with a successful program. My comment was much more about if we were able to get to that stage, that would certainly be a moment to stop and pause and just recognise the effort that had gone into it from every element in the community. We've had intense debates between adherents and supporters of the concept of freedom of speech, and they've come into conflict with some of the aspects of intellectual property rights and trademarks. A very healthy tension in society and in ICANN, and we've resolved that satisfactorily. We've had a huge tension between governments who've been concerned about what would happen if sensitive strings that were culturally or religiously offended national sensitivities. What was going to happen if they came through? What would be the process? And we've resolved that. So I think my comment was I could see that we were coming to the point which we've now reached here in Singapore, and that when we did, it would be an appropriate time to stop and just mark it in some way as the success of the multi-stakeholder model in solving what's been a set of very difficult problems.
Talk to me a little bit about the external perception of ICANN. Are people starting to understand its role?
Well, I think it has. I think I've seen some changes in that. For example, it's now routinely studied as a matter of master's and PhD theses as multi-stakeholder model and internet governance. These are now actually recognised academic topics when they weren't 11 or 12 years ago. 11 or 12 years ago, and probably up till about 5 years ago, we would hear people talk about the ICANN experiment. And it was an experiment. Could a multi-stakeholder model be built that could coordinate this incredible resource? And we seem to have passed that point. We probably passed it 4 or 5 years ago, but we don't really notice until looking back. We observe it, but we no longer talk about the ICANN experiment. This is now a globally accepted method of doing this kind of thing. And we've seen that acceptance changing through the WSIS process, where there was a heavy discussion at the UN level about whether or not this kind of body should be responsible for something as important as this. And in the end, the conclusion was, well, yes, it should. So I think there's lots of signs that we've got that kind of acceptance. We've got all of the members of the G8, for example, are now contributing members of our Governmental Advisory Committee. And that's out of say, about 110, I think 110 governments are now participating actively in that. So everywhere you look now, there's signs that this is accepted, it's working, and it's being supported. That's the change.
In New Zealand, you're a well-respected barrister, but I imagine that being ICANN board chair probably consumes at least as much time, if not more, as your paid profession.
Yes, it's partly the nature of the board. It's not a normal corporation, and so it doesn't operate under normal corporate governance rules. We certainly have all those as well. We have the fiduciary relationships. We have to manage things like the budget and the staff and relationships and contractual compliance. And preparing a strategic plan, etc., that all corporations have. So on the one hand, we've got that. Excuse me. But in addition to that, the board is seen as the guardian of the public policy development process. The board is the organ of last resort in this multi-stakeholder model, which is completely different from an ordinary corporation. We don't have shareholders that we in the ordinary sense. Our shareholders are the multi-stakeholder model constituencies, and so the board is in the end at the apex of that policy development process. And for that reason, the board has to get involved very often to a much deeper level in the weeds of policy development process than we would if we were an ordinary corporate board. I've sat on other boards, and it's lovely to be able to ask the staff, has this been through the process? Are there any questions that the board should be aware of? And the answer is yes, no, and then the board votes. Here, the board has got to get often deeply involved in the issues and understanding and going back to the community. And so, as a result of all that, all of the board members spend far greater time on this than I would imagine on any other board commitment they have. And being the chair is just a larger example of that. So yes, it does take a considerable amount of time.
Peter, what's next for you?
Well, I go back to New Zealand. I have a short holiday from here. We're in a very interesting part of Asia, and I'm going to take a couple of days to recover. You know that an ICANN meeting for me runs for about 8 days, pretty intense meetings, etc. So we'll take a few days after that to recover, and then I go back to New Zealand and try and revive the law practice that I've had. And I sit as on a couple of New Zealand administrative and other tribunals, and I've got that kind of work to go back to.
Finally, Peter, if you had any advice for your successor, what would it be?
I think remain open to the challenges that come up from the community. It's very easy sometimes to think that there's a right way of doing things, but the multi-stakeholder model will change any views that you have about that. So I think keeping your mind open to solutions that the community develops, I suppose, is probably the major one.
Peter, thank you very much.
Thanks, Brad. It's been a pleasure.